So, jumping the gun, you're going to hear us singing a bit later.
I'm here to interview Anthony Akerman on his wonderful adoption memoir. Anthony, he was such a...
Well, wait. You might want to know why my wife is interviewing me. It's partly because I wanted to have, apparently now it's either called a discussant, which it's a bit of a revolting word, but or an interlocutor, which I prefer. But it's because she won't ask any rude questions, and she's not going to embarrass me at all. On the other hand, it's a great South African tradition. It's called nepotism. If you've got jobs to offer, choose family, and it's such a well-paying job that's why she's got it. So thank you.
And I've got a few Louis Vuitton handbags now. Anyway, Anthony was a remarkable little boy. He was very gifted and had a great imagination. And he had incredible talent in languages. Can you imagine? He had a little set of Roman soldiers, and they all spoke to each other in Latin. Nogal. And he also won all the Afrikaans prizes, which was fantastic.
Yes, well, yeah. I had little Roman soldiers. They were called swappets in those days. And when I was 11, can you imagine how precocious I was? I asked my dad for a Latin dictionary for my birthday. So my soldiers had to speak Latin to each other to make it real. And then, of course, what happened in Standard 3 was that I won the Afrikaans prize, which was devastatingly embarrassing in colonial Natal in those days, because the last thing you'd want is that people would think that maybe you had Afrikaans blood and you could be called an Afrikaner vrot banana, you know. So that was a mortification, because I 3 years in a row kind of won the Afrikaans prize in Hillcrest. But
and he thought you were terribly English because his great-grandfather was knighted by Queen Victoria, and they had this beautiful sword in the attic that he could play with. And you had this wonderful childhood of imagining all these things. Tell me what happened when you were 10 years old.
Okay, so that's true. I think Queen Victoria was quite amused when she knighted my great-grandfather. But if you look at her in the Victoria Manor, the photograph there, I took it today, she looks quite a sourpuss. But it was quite something, because I had the sword that had actually been held by Queen Victoria. And there I was in South Africa holding the same sword that had been held by one of the most famous people in the world. So I had this family that I grew up with, and was an interesting family. And then when I was 10 years old, it came out. We were actually, for those who come from KZN, you will know Fields Hill. We were actually driving down Fields Hill. And I won't go into details what brought it up, but my parents told my sister and I that we had been adopted. And that was a kind of seismic event, because you suddenly realized that everything that you'd thought was true was not true. So Mum and Dad were not my mother and father. My sister sitting next to me was not my sister. It explained a little bit why we were so different, but it was a bit devastating, because my grandparents were, and even Sir John Akerman, who was knighted by Queen Victoria, was not my great-grandfather. So that was quite a shock, when you're 10 years old.
You were being lied to, really.
Well, exactly, because my parents had always said telling lies is a bad thing, and actually what they had done was they had lied to me for 10 years. And the awful thing really was that it was also kind of like I felt less worthy. I wasn't real. I wasn't a real child of the Akerman family. I didn't really belong to them. So where did I belong, and what was my story? Well, Mum and Dad didn't know, and it was a big secret in those days, because that's how adoption was handled. The records were closed. They weren't allowed to know, and they couldn't tell me anything except that they thought my mother was a nurse and my father was a student. I did meet another guy who'd been adopted, and he told me that he'd heard his father was a student and his mother a nurse. So I thought it was just generic bullshit that they were giving to me, so you couldn't really believe that. But, you know, everybody needs an origin story. You need to kind of know where you come from, because if you don't know that, you kind of don't know who you are. And so you'd kind of invent them. You'd think, what are the possible scenarios? This is maybe how you become a writer, you know, like, well, prepare yourself for the worst thing. My mother was a whore working in Point Road in Durban, and my dad was a sailor on a passing ship. Okay, nothing could be worse than that, really. So you prepared for that. Or else, you know, then you had the romantic thing, the kind of story like The Student Prince, you know, that your Ruritanian version, where your mother was a princess and your father had been a peasant or something, and they had to get rid of you because otherwise you would have been in line for to the throne and you would have caused chaos. And then, of course, there was the other thing that your parents are driving over a level crossing, like this one coming here, which, amazingly, they still have trains running from Craddock, and the train hit the car and your parents were both killed and you were in the back seat and you were spared because Jesus had a plan for you. Wasn't ideal, but I mean, these were the kind of stories that you worked on. And so that was, yeah, that was the big shock that I had when I was 10, and also that I would never be able to know the answer to that.
And Anthony, you grew up with a father who wasn't your biological father, but he did have a lot of influence on you, particularly when it come to collecting stuff. He's a great collector. We've got boxes and boxes of things like bus tickets that go back there and then, and postcards and people's passports from ancient years ago. I mean, I can't believe all the stuff that he's collected. And I used to think, what's he going to do with all this stuff? And actually it was wonderful, because when Anthony wrote this memoir, all this material was there for him. And he came across a letter that he had written to his parents when he was 14 years old. Anthony, I'd love you to read that letter and tell us a bit about your...
Okay, I'll just preface that. I mean, it is the nature-nurture thing, because you're very interested when you're adopted. What have I, you know, behaviorists always used to think that you can turn a child into what you want a child to be through teaching a child certain behaviors and things. And then the other people say, no, it is hereditary. And it's a mixture of both. But I did learn a lot of those kind of things from my dad. Unfortunately, one of the things that had happened was that when I was 13, I was sent away to boarding school in the Natal Midlands. And it was a family tradition. My father had been sent there, he was miserable, so he sent me there to make me miserable as well. It was a great English tradition. And I was, you know, most teenagers, we know teenagers are by definition quite rebellious. It's textbook that adoptees are more rebellious than other teenagers, because it's about identity. You're looking for your identity, and it's a particularly vexed issue for adoptees. I was very rebellious, and I went to a school called Michael House. I was very rebellious there and self-sabotaged. When I was writing the memoir, you know, because you didn't, you know, as all writers will know, writing is also a journey of discovery. You think you know everything before you start, but you actually don't. And you discover things. I understood that being sent away to boarding school was a second form of abandonment. I'd been, you know, there's an interesting Dutch-American psychiatrist called Bessel van der Kolk who wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which I recently was recommended to me by an fellow adoptee. And it's quite interesting, you know, things that happen before you verbal. I mean, what happens to a little baby? The body keeps the score. You somehow know what's happened. So I didn't understand it at the time, but that was partly my rebellion at school, had to do with that. And unfortunately, what's rather stupid is that you go and self-sabotage. I thought it was being clever. A form of passive-aggressive rebellion at school was not to work. I arrived at the school, I was in the top grade for every subject, and I dropped down to about the 4th grade for every subject, except Afrikaans, I have to say. And so this is a letter that I wrote to my parents. I'd obviously had a pep talk in the holidays about my attitude. So
Can
got a
you
bit of
see?
light? I can see, yeah. Dear folks, thanks for your pep talk. When I leave school, I'm going to be a dentist, a doctor, and a lawyer. My part-time jobs I'm going to do are barber, pop singer, salesman for Acme hairpins, a barman, work in Hillcrest Post Office, a policeman, a train driver, a cowboy, write James Bond books, poetry and piano concertos, and a bus driver. How's that for ambition? Anyway, seeing as I've got 2.5 years left at school and a year in the army, there is a possibility that I might change my plans. Mr. Law, who was my housemaster, hasn't touched me so far this term, but he has done some bloody scaly things to John Brand, which I will tell you about when I'm on my leave. Dad, please don't worry too much about the trouble I'm getting into at school. It only makes your blood pressure go up and does bad to 2 people. Mum, you just pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile. My troubles are Michael House, and when I pack them up in my old kit bag or trunk, I'll only be too pleased to smile. But until then, misery. Please, for my Sunday the 16th, have the following items ready. A spool for my 35mm camera, the one I won on the raffle at school, a red pen, ballpoint, and some stamps. Preserve this letter because it is very unique, because it is the last letter you will ever get from your 14-year-old son. This is the last time I will be 14 for a long time. I haven't smoked at all this term, and I'm not craving or anything like that. See, Dad, I've got willpower. Now you can drop your blood pressure by 20 points. Lekker, lekker. And then it ends off by saying, love from your ever-loving, alcoholic, duck-tailish, hooligan, drug addict, and all-around good-for-nothing with no ambition son, Tony. P.S. I will write again soon. P.P.S. Please don't forget the film. And my dad did keep the letter. I found it in his desk after he died.
Yeah, it's amazing, hey? Yeah, I can detect the budding writer in that little boy, eh? Anthony, when I met you, you had all these bracelets all the way up your arm. Yeah, I got a few left there. And you said to me that you collected a bracelet for each year that you were out of this country. Can you tell us a bit about the exile and how you landed up being there?
Yeah, I eventually had 17 bracelets. It was rather heavy, and and every time if I had to do a voiceover for a film or something, I had to strap it up with tape because it would go clank, clank, clank. Yes, I think when I was a kid, I wanted to leave South Africa. It was around about the time that Verwoerd came up with his republic, and although my parents were quite conservative United Party, I had a friend whose parents were progs. They knew all about this, and they said that Verwoerd was going to ban God Save the Queen, but also English. We were not going to be allowed to speak English, and I thought, well, fuck this. I'm getting out of the country. So I had plans to leave when I was about 11 years old. Then, yeah, those were just maybe romantic kind of plans. Then later, of course, as you got older, when I went into the army, I didn't really see it as a particularly political thing at the time. But later on at university, I did get to see it that way, and I got into trouble with the army, and I was not going to do any more camps. I was not going to do any parades, etc. The only reason I went to Rhodes University was to get away from Natal University, where they'd catch me for parades every month. And I decided I would leave South Africa. So really to get away from that, but to have a great career internationally. I thought I'd go to England and feel very English. Well, as soon as I got to England, I found out that I wasn't all that English, and most of my friends were South Africans anyway. But, and I spent 2 years studying in England, and then circumstances dictated that I met somebody from Holland who ran the anti-apartheid movement. I was invited. She was a friend of Brayton Breitenbach's, who I'd met, etc., etc. And so I ended up in Amsterdam, which was my home for 17 years. So that's how I ended up there. And I became a Dutch citizen. Ben nog steeds een Nederlandse staatsburger, toch?
Your book has so many interesting themes. But one of the underlying themes that is in the book that seems to come along or join it all together is the underlying theme of your search for identity and to feel that you really, really would love to know who you are, and you searched for your mother. This was the major thing, was searching for your mother. Can you tell us a bit about that search?
Yeah, well, look, when I left South Africa, I also realized, I thought, if my parents were around, and seeing I was adopted in Durban, I kind of assumed that my family had come from Durban. I don't know why I assumed that, but I often thought, imagine if, I might be walking past my father in the street. And then, of course, I'd read Oedipus Rex at school, which was like a cautionary tale for all adoptees. Kill your father, have sex with your mother. God, it can't get worse than that, So, but I did think that when I left South Africa, I realized that it was highly likely that I would never run into any biological relations. And when I arrive in Holland, Dutch friends who'd meet me say, they pronounce my name Akerman. They'd say, oh, ben je van Nederlandse familie? And I'd say, well, no, I don't know, actually. Anyway, it's not my real name. I'm adopted and I don't know where I come from. My adopted sister, married a Swiss guy and was living in near Zurich. And on one of my holidays there, she told me that she had got Fair Lady from South Africa. She subscribed to that. I used to read the Communist Manifesto. And she told me that they'd changed the law in South Africa. What law? I said, the law about finding your biological parents. And it was actually the Children's Act of 1983 that became active in 1986. And that was because adoptees do have you should have the right to know if you've inherited terrible illnesses that you might pass on to children. If you don't know where you come from, you don't know what you might be passing on. So this is how the law had been changed. And my sister, who always, and with some justification, thought that I got a better deal in life, she said, I'm going to try and contact my mother first so you don't. So I wrote to my dad, you needed permission from your adoptive parents to get identifying information. So Jill asked me if I'd write to mum and dad, which I did. And then as a kind of afterthought, I said to my dad, because I think he was about 69 then, I thought he had one foot in the grave, and I said to him, listen, if there's anything you know about me, please don't take that secret with you to your grave. And 6 weeks later, I got a letter back in which he told me, and it was obvious, I'd never thought of it, he told me what my name had been when he said, when you were born, your name was Peter Farnham. And it was a shock because, it's so obvious. You have to register a baby within a couple of days or weeks of birth. And it had never really occurred to me that I must have had a name before. And that was a clue as to possibly what Farnham didn't sound very Afrikaans. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So that's all I knew. And then I waited. My sister, first, she made contact with Child Welfare in Cape Town and discovered that her birth mother had died 9 months before. And that's a terribly disappointing thing when you've waited so much in your life. And then I thought, God, I better, Suddenly I became hugely impatient. I think I was about 38 then, 38 going on 39. And I started pestering them with letters and pestering them. And they actually found my mother within 3 months of my first letter. And she lived 3 kilometers away from Child Welfare she lived in Newlands in Cape Town. And she was very happy to have contact with me, because that's also another thing that your mother could be dead, or B, she would not be willing to have contact, and that also happens. So that was fantastic, but there was one glitch. I had been refused a visa for South Africa 2 years before, so I couldn't get on a plane and come back and meet my mother. So for at least a year or two, I think I came back in 1990, and I made contact with her at the end of 1988. We corresponded frequently, and it's when you meet a birth mother, it is like the experience is like falling in love. So I had this kind of love affair with my mother, and we were writing letters almost every day. Of course, in those days you didn't have WhatsApp, you couldn't make phone calls, and you could, but it was like 10 rand a minute, you know, to when the rand was worth something, you know. So we exchanged a lot of letters, and I first spoke to her on her 61st birthday, etc. But your mother is also, then I discovered more about my family, about siblings. And of course, the most precious thing about knowing who your mother is, because your mother, and the law also acknowledges it, is the one person who knows who your father is, who your biological father is. So what is that? Anyway, so that's, yeah, so I made contact with my... Op die volgende slag van die gong is het...
Yeah. Well, Anthony did find his father. And if you want to know who he is, you're going to have to read the book. Because he's a household name. Thank you very much, Isak and Etienne.
Just one thing I wanted to add is a little kicker there. When I did get to, you know, meet my mother and find out more and more about her family, I was able to put together my genealogy and been able to trace my ancestors back to French Belgium. They were Huguenots who fled, went to Holland, came out from Holland to South Africa, the Dutois. So I put that all together, and apart from a certain component of Irishness, which my adopted mother said, that explains your benechtheid, that I've got 70% what was known as, could be called Afrikaans blood, from Dutch, German, French Huguenot. So that was a kind of interesting thing to discover. A lovely kind of irony that the universe enjoys. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.